When the plane touched down at Lex, 4 police cars were waiting on the tarmac. Captain Sam had radioed ahead, calmly explaining the situation and requesting law enforcement presence, not for arrests, but as a precaution. The bright California sun reflected off the police vehicles as the aircraft taxied to its gate. The Steel Dragons were quiet as they filed off the plane, their earlier swagger replaced by subdued embarrassment. Rick paused at the cabin door, turning to face Sam, who stood nearby. "I messed up," he said simply, extending his hand. "Won't happen again, Captain." Sam shook it firmly, noting the genuine regret in the biker's eyes. As other passengers deplaned, many stopped to thank Sam. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at the captain. "Mom, he's like a superhero, but in a pilot's uniform." Sam smiled, remembering his own childhood dreams of flying. Sometimes life took unexpected turns to get you where you needed to be. The video, shot by the teenage passenger, hit social media before the last bag was claimed from baggage carousel. By sunset, it had gone viral. People were captivated by the quiet strength displayed at 35,000 feet, no punches thrown, no voices raised, just pure command presence that turned a potentially dangerous situation into a powerful lesson. News crews gathered at the airport, hoping to interview the pilot protector, as headlines were already calling him. But Sam slipped out quietly through a side entrance, heading home to his family. He'd never been one for spotlight. His years in special operations had taught him that the best work often went unnoticed. A week later, the Steel Dragons' national leadership issued a formal apology. They announced new guidelines for their members about respecting public spaces and fellow travelers. Rick's chapter took it further, starting a program where they escorted elderly veterans to their medical appointments, turning their tough guy image into something positive. The airline industry took notice too. Sam was asked to help develop a new training program for flight crews, teaching them how to handle difficult situations with calm authority. "It's not about being the toughest person in the room," he'd tell them. "It's about being the calmest." Lisa and Andy continued flying, now with a deeper understanding of true leadership. They shared the story with new crew members, not as a tale of confrontation, but as an example of how presence and composure could deflate even the most tense situations. The incident sparked conversations nationwide about hidden heroes, the everyday people carrying extraordinary experiences beneath ordinary exteriors. Veterans groups used it to highlight how military training could be channeled into civilian peacekeeping, while flight attendant unions pointed to it as a model for passenger management. Months later, Sam still received letters from passengers who were on that flight. Many wrote about how the experience had changed their perspective on handling conflict. A high school teacher even used the video in her conflict resolution class, showing students that real strength often whispers rather than shouts. One quiet evening, as Sam prepared for another flight, he found a new addition to his pilot's uniform, a small pin bearing the airline's wings wrapped in a laurel wreath, a special commendation rarely given. He pinned it on without ceremony, straightened his tie, and headed out to greet his next group of passengers with the same warm smile he'd always worn. The resolution happened faster than anyone expected. In less than 5 minutes, Captain Sam had completely transformed the atmosphere in the cabin without raising his voice or lifting a finger. The bikers, who had seemed so threatening just moments before, now sat quietly in their seats, the fight gone out of them like air from a punctured tire. Rick, their leader, kept his eyes fixed on the seat in front of him, his earlier bravado replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. The other members of the Steel Dragons followed his lead, some pretending to sleep, while others stared out the windows at the endless blue sky. "Everything all right here?" Sam asked Lisa, his voice returning to its usual friendly tone. She nodded, rubbing her wrist where Rick had grabbed her. The transformation in the captain was remarkable, like watching a sword being sheathed, the blade hidden but not forgotten. Other passengers were still processing what they'd witnessed. A young woman in business attire leaned over to her seatmate and whispered, "I've never seen anything like that." Her neighbor, an off-duty police officer, nodded in agreement. "That's the kind of control you only get from years of real-world experience," he murmured back. The teenager who'd been recording everything on his phone finally lowered his device, knowing he'd captured something special. His hands were shaking slightly as he saved the video, already imagining how many views it would get. But more than that, he'd learned something about real strength, how it often came wrapped in quietness and control rather than shouting and threats. Sam moved through the cabin, checking on passengers with a warm smile that made it easy to forget the steel that had been visible just moments before. He stopped to comfort a young mother whose child had been frightened by the early attention, speaking softly and offering the little one his pilot's wings pin. First Officer Tom watched from the cockpit door, shaking his head in amazement. He'd known Sam was ex-military, but this was something else entirely. The way he'd handled the situation would become required viewing in flight crew training videos and masterclass in de-escalation. The other flight attendants resumed their duties, but now they moved through the cabin with renewed confidence. Andy, who'd been ready to quit after this flight, found himself reconsidering. Having a captain like Sam made him feel safer than any self-defense training ever had. Lisa brought water to the bikers. No one had to say that alcohol service was finished for this flight. As she passed out the cups, she noticed how they couldn't meet her eyes. Rick mumbled something that might have been an apology, his face red with embarrassment rather than anger now. A gentle chime sounded through the cabin as Sam picked up the intercom mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about an hour from our destination. The weather in Los Angeles is clear and sunny, and we expect a smooth landing. Thank you for your patience during our recent discussion. The rest of the flight should be much more peaceful." The tension that had filled the cabin like a storm cloud was gone, replaced by something almost like relief. Passengers who had been afraid to make eye contact now shared knowing looks and small smiles. A businessman who'd been clutching his laptop like a shield finally relaxed enough to return to his work. What struck most observers was how Sam had done it all without violence or even the threat of it. He used something far more powerful, the absolute certainty that he was in control of the situation, backed by years of experience in handling far worse scenarios. It was a lesson in true authority that none of the witnesses would soon forget. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically as Captain Sam stepped fully into his element. Gone was any trace of the friendly airline pilot, replaced by something far more formidable. His movements were precise and measured, each step calculated as he positioned himself strategically in the aisle. Rick still hadn't released Lisa's wrist, but his grip had loosened slightly. The uncertainty in his eyes betrayed his internal struggle, the alcohol in his system urging him forward, while some primitive survival instinct warned him to back down. The other bikers shifted uneasily, sensing the change in the air, but not quite understanding it. First, Sam spoke, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding in crisis situations. "You're going to let go of my flight attendant." It wasn't a request. The words hung in the air like physical things, backed by something that made Rick's fingers slowly uncurl from Lisa's wrist. A few rows back, a businessman who had served in the military straightened in his seat, recognizing the bearing of someone who had led men into combat. He wasn't the only one. Several passengers with service backgrounds had picked up on subtle cues in Sam's stance and tone that spoke of extensive tactical training. "We paid for our tickets," one of the younger bikers started to argue, but fell silent when Sam's gaze shifted to him. There was something in that look, not aggression or anger, but the kind of calm certainty that comes from having handled far worse situations than this. Sam had positioned himself perfectly, using the narrow aisle to his advantage. To the untrained eye, he appeared relaxed, but he had arranged himself so that no more than two people could approach him at once. His hands remained visible and open at his sides, non-threatening but ready. "Here's what's going to happen," Sam continued, his voice level but carrying to every corner of the cabin. "You're all going to return to your assigned seats. You'll fasten your seatbelts. And for the remainder of this flight, you'll behave like the responsible adults I'm sure your mothers raised you to be." The cabin held its breath. Rick, still trying to maintain his authority, took half a step forward. Sam didn't move, didn't flinch, but something in his stance made Rick reconsider. It was like watching a wave break against a cliff, all that aggressive energy dissipating against something immovable. "And if we don't?" Rick asked, but the bluster in his voice had faded. He was sobering up quickly now, reality breaking through the alcohol-induced haze. His friends looked less certain by the second, the pack mentality that had fueled their behavior crumbling in the face of real authority. Sam's next words were quiet but clear. "Then I'll be forced to divert this aircraft to the nearest airport. where I assure you there will be a welcoming committee very interested in discussing the federal laws regarding interference with a flight crew." He paused, letting that sink in. "And trust me when I say that's the option you'll prefer over making me handle this personally." The threat wasn't in his words, it was in everything he didn't say. It was in the way he stood, the alertness in his eyes, the complete absence of fear or uncertainty in his bearing. This was a man who had faced down far worse threats than a group of rowdy bikers, and everyone in that cabin could sense it. A cell phone captured the moment in shaky footage, the small moans of submission as, one by one, the bikers recognized their only sensible choice. The tension in the cabin began to dissolve, replaced by a collective sense of relief as the troublemakers slowly made their way back to their seats. The revelation of Captain Sam's true identity started like a whisper through the cabin. As he stood in the aisle, his pilot's uniform perfectly pressed, something had changed in his demeanor. The friendly smile that had greeted passengers during boarding was replaced by an expression of calm focus that spoke of years of handling crisis situations. First Officer Tom watched from the cockpit door as his captain approached the group of bikers. He'd flown with Sam for 3 years, but he'd never seen this side of him. The way Sam moved, each step precise, deliberate, always maintaining perfect balance despite the occasional turbulence, reminded Tom of his brother who'd served in special forces. None of the passengers knew that before Sam earned his commercial pilot's wings, he'd spent 12 years as part of an elite military unit. His missions had taken him to some of the world's most dangerous places, where he'd learned that the quietest person in the room was often the most dangerous. Those skills, carefully hidden beneath years of friendly passenger interactions, were about to become very relevant. "Gentlemen," Sam's voice carried clearly through the cabin without being raised, "I believe we need to discuss your current behavior." His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but his stance subtly shifted to give him better balance in the narrow aisle. The other passengers noticed something different about him too, like watching a house cat suddenly reveal its tiger ancestry. Rick, still gripping Lisa's wrist, turned to face the new voice. Even in his alcohol-clouded state, something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way Sam stood, or perhaps the strange clarity in his eyes, the look of someone who had seen far worse situations than this and remained unimpressed. "Listen here, Captain," Rick started, trying to draw himself up to his full height, but his words trailed off as Sam took another step forward. The overhead lights caught the ribbons on Sam's uniform jacket. Decorations most passengers wouldn't recognize, but that told a story of valor and service far beyond the cockpit. A young flight attendant, watching from the galley, noticed how Sam had positioned himself. Without seeming to move much at all, he'd managed to place himself between the bikers and the rest of the passengers. His body language was relaxed, but she realized he also made sure he could see everyone's hands. The truth about Sam's background had stayed buried in his personnel file, mentioned only as prior military service. The airline knew, of course, his experience had made him especially valuable for international routes through troubled regions. But he'd never had to draw on those skills, preferring to leave that part of his life firmly in the past. Now, as he stood in the airplane's aisle at 35,000 feet, those years of training thrummed just beneath the surface. He noted every detail, the positions of his crew members, the nearest emergency exits, the slight tremor in Rick's hands that suggested he was more bark than bite. Most importantly, he recognized the look in the other biker's eyes, the uncertainty that comes when someone unexpectedly changes the rules of engagement. "There are 2 ways this can go," Sam continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "The choice is yours, but I want you to think very carefully about your next move." He didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. His presence alone had changed the dynamics of the situation. The other passengers watched in fascinated silence as the scene unfolded. An elderly couple exchanged glances, sensing they were watching something extraordinary. A teenager who had been recording the trouble on his phone kept filming, somehow knowing he was capturing a moment that would soon go viral for all the right reasons. The cabin erupted into chaos when Rick grabbed Lisa's arm as she tried to pass with the beverage cart. The senior flight attendant had politely declined his demand for more alcohol, maintaining her professional composure even as his massive hand closed around her wrist. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, fear and uncertainty frozen on their faces. "Let go of me, sir," Lisa said firmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She dealt with difficult passengers before, but something in Rick's bloodshot eyes told her this was different. The cart rattled as she tried to pull away, sending plastic cups clattering to the floor. Andy, watching from the forward galley, immediately grabbed the interphone to alert the cockpit. His hands trembled as he pressed the call button, knowing this situation could spiral out of control at any moment. "Captain, we have a situation in the main cabin," he said, trying to keep his voice low and calm. "We need assistance immediately." 2 rows behind Rick, a mother pulled her young son closer, shielding his eyes from the scene. An elderly man halfway up the aisle slowly reached for his call button, then thought better of it when one of the other bikers shot him a threatening look. The tension in the cabin was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Other members of the Steel Dragons had risen from their seats now, forming a loose circle around Lisa and their leader. Their leather vests creaked as they moved, the sound somehow menacing in the confined space. A businessman in a neat suit gripped his armrest so hard his knuckles turned white, while a college student nearby pretended to be deeply absorbed in her phone, though her shaking hands betrayed her fear. "Maybe you need to learn some customer service skills," Rick growled, his words slightly slurred, but his grip remaining firm. His friends laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the pressurized cabin. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, the wail cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. In the cockpit, First Officer Tom relayed the message to Captain Sam, who had just returned from his break. The captain's expression changed subtly as he listened to the report, not fear or anger, but something else. A calm focus seemed to settle over him, like a cloud passing over the sun. Lisa managed to twist free from Rick's grip, but as she stepped back, she bumped into another biker who had moved behind her. The beverage cart tipped precariously, and several passengers gasped. Time seemed to slow down as the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Through the thin curtain separating the galleys, Andy could see Captain Sam emerging from the cockpit. The captain's movements were deliberate, unhurried, but there was something different about his bearing now. Gone was the friendly commercial pilot who had greeted passengers during boarding. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone who moved with the quiet confidence of a person who had handled far worse situations than this. The overhead lights flickered briefly, casting strange shadows across the scene. Rick and his friends were too focused on Lisa to notice the captain's approach, but several passengers did. A ripple of something, not quite hope, but close to it, passed through the cabin. Just as another biker reached for Lisa's shoulder, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I believe there's a problem here that needs my attention." The words were quiet, but they carried to every corner of the aircraft. Captain Sam stood at the end of the aisle, his uniform crisp, his posture relaxed but alert. The next few moments would become the stuff of legend, shared countless times on social media and news broadcasts. But right then, suspended 7 miles above the earth, no one knew exactly what was about to happen. They only knew that something had shifted in the air, like the calm before a storm, and they were about to witness something extraordinary. 3 hours into the flight, the calm of cruising altitude gave way to growing unrest. The trouble started small, as it often does. The Steel Dragons had been steadily working their way through the plane's alcohol supply, their voices getting louder with each passing hour. The other passengers had noticed the change, their bodies tensing every time one of the bikers stood up or called out for service. "Another round here," bellowed Rick, the group's leader, his massive frame filling the aisle as he waved down a flight attendant. His face had grown red from drinking, and his movements were becoming less coordinated. The younger members of his group, eager to impress their leader, grew bolder with each drink. Lisa, the senior flight attendant, approached their section with practiced calm. She'd handled difficult passengers before, but something about this group made her stomach knot. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think we'll need to take a break from the alcohol service for a while," she said firmly, maintaining eye contact despite having to look up at Rick's towering figure. "Come on, sweetheart, don't be like that," Rick growled, reaching out to grab her wrist. Lisa stepped back quickly, her professional smile never wavering even as her heart raced. A businessman in the row ahead pretended to be deeply absorbed in his laptop screen, while a teenage girl nearby pulled her headphones tighter over her ears. 2 rows behind them, an off-duty police officer tensed, ready to intervene if needed. But he knew the risks of confrontation in a pressurized cabin at 35,000 feet. One wrong move could endanger everyone on board. The other bikers had spread out through the cabin by now, ignoring the seatbelt signs. One of them, a younger member with a fresh tattoo visible on his neck, kept pacing between the bathrooms and their original seats, bumping into passengers without apologizing. An elderly couple gripped their armrests tighter with each pass. In the galley, the flight attendants held a hushed conference. "We need to tell the captain," whispered Andy, the newest crew member, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by worry. "They're getting worse, and we still have 2 hours to go." Through the thin curtain separating business class, they could hear more commotion. The bikers had started arguing with a passenger who'd asked them to lower their voices. The man's wife clutched his arm, trying to pull him back into his seat as Rick and his friends surrounded them. A child started crying somewhere in the back of the plane. The sound seemed to echo through the cabin, highlighting the tension that had been building for hours. Other passengers exchanged nervous glances, some reaching for their call buttons only to hesitate, unsure if drawing attention to themselves would make things worse. In the cockpit, First Officer Tom monitored the instruments, unaware of the situation deteriorating behind him. Captain Sam was taking his scheduled rest break, leaving Tom in command. The plane cruised smoothly through clear skies, the gentle hum of the engines masking the growing chaos in the cabin. The breaking point came when one of the bikers stumbled into business class, ignoring the crew's attempts to redirect him back to his assigned seat. He leaned over a young professional woman's seat, breathing heavily as he tried to start a conversation she clearly didn't want. Lisa knew they'd reached a critical moment. With hands that remained surprisingly steady, she picked up the interphone to call the cockpit. As she waited for a response, she watched Rick and his friends becoming increasingly confrontational with anyone who dared to meet their eyes. The situation was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning shorter by the second. What no one realized was that the next few minutes would transform this flight from a troubling story of mile-high harassment into something that would captivate the nation's attention for weeks to come. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Captain Sam Wilson arrived at O'Hare International Airport for what he thought would be another routine flight to Los Angeles. 20 years in the cockpit had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold at Gate B-17. As he walked through the terminal, pulling his neat pilot's bag behind him, Sam noticed an unusual gathering near his gate. A group of burly men in leather vests were sprawled across the waiting area chairs, their heavy boots propped up on nearby seats. The patches on their vests identified them as members of the Steel Dragons, a motorcycle club known more for their road presence than their flying habits. "Morning, Captain," called out Jenny, the gate agent, her voice carrying a hint of concern as she handed him the passenger manifest. Her eyes darted nervously toward the bikers, who were now loudly discussing their plans for a big rally in LA. Sam noticed how other passengers kept their distance, creating an invisible bubble around the leather-clad group. During the pre-flight checks in the cockpit, First Officer Tom Chen brought up what everyone was thinking. "Heard we've got some interesting passengers today," he said, adjusting his seat. "The flight attendants are a bit nervous." Sam nodded, his mind drifting back to his days before aviation. Few people knew that before he started flying commercial jets, he'd spent 12 years in special operations, handling situations far more intense than rowdy passengers. But those were memories he preferred to keep locked away, useful skills he hoped he'd never need to use again. The boarding process started smoothly enough. Business travelers in pressed suits, families with young children, and a few solo tourists filed in, filling the cabin with the usual pre-flight buzz. Then came the bikers. The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. They swaggered down the aisle, leather vests creaking, chains jingling with each step. Their leader, a mountain of a man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, had to turn sideways just to fit through the cabin. The smell of leather and motor oil trailed behind them, mixing with the plane's recycled air. Sam watched through the cockpit's open door as they settled into their seats, spreading out more than necessary, their loud laughter and rough language already drawing concerned looks from nearby passengers. A young mother clutched her child closer, while an elderly gentleman buried his nose deeper in his newspaper. Flight attendant Lisa Woods, a veteran of the skies herself, stopped by the cockpit. They've already asked about alcohol service, she said, keeping her voice low. And we haven't even left the gate. Her usual confident smile wavered slightly. As Sam began the final preparations for takeoff, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be different. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years. They'd saved his life more than once in his previous career. But for now, he focused on his pre-flight checklist, his movements precise and practiced. The engines roared to life, and the massive aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. In the cabin behind him, the usual safety demonstration was underway, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter from the bikers. Sam caught glimpses of the ground crew's hand signals through his window, their movements silhouetted against the brightening morning sky. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but routine. As the aircraft lifted off the runway, climbing into the crisp morning air, none of the 162 souls on board could have guessed how their lives would intersect in the next few hours. The stage was set for an encounter that would soon make headlines across the country and change perspectives about heroes hiding in plain sight.